Why do people hate Christians who stand against the cultural norms, the culture of death? And how should we react when culture says Christianity is hateful and bigoted? Author of the new book, When Culture Hates You, and host of the Natasha Crain podcast, my friend Natasha Crain joins the show today to talk about Christianity's clash with culture, the controversial, remember, He Gets Us Super Bowl ad and campaign, and how people during biblical times dealt with the political evils of their time. Listen, go give us a rating and review. It really helps, okay? If you're on iTunes, just the 5 stars, the podcast app, super helps. More people see it. They listen. They get fired up. Go to Rumble and subscribe in case YouTube ever cancels me. They've come hard against the show and the channel before, guys. And go to the whiterose.life to become an ally of the White Rose Resistance. That's a $35 a month ally supporter, and you get your battle box in the mail, and you join our White Rose app. We have a White Rose app, guys, with all of our media, films, curriculum, courses, book club at $70 a month. Book club, right, for air support. Our next book is one of Dr. Nancy Piercy's book. It's so fun. Okay, go to the whiterose.life and become an ally. Let's get into it. This is the Seth Gruber Show. Well, Natasha, welcome to the show, finally. Way too overdue. Total warrior. I've talked about you before on the show. I love retweeting your stuff on X. You're one of the kind of few Christian apologists in this insane era of Western civilization that I feel like gets it, is willing to say the things that needs to be said, and doesn't hold back because, you know, you might lose your speaking engagements or book sales. And I feel like you have the courage that's oftentimes lacking. And so we're just so grateful for you. Tell us about your new book.
Well, thanks, Seth. I appreciate it, and it's great to talk with you. Well, I have a new book. It's called When Culture Hates You, and the subtitle is Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. So this book came about because over the last 2 to 3 years, I realized as I was out speaking with people at engagements and conferences and engaging with people online that increasingly people were sharing with me how they were noticing the culture becoming not just more hostile in general toward Christians and biblical values, as we all see, but in their personal lives, they were experiencing this. They were getting cut off by their family members and by their friends, and in some cases even losing jobs over some of the issues that you hear about in the news. And usually it's just because of what people believe. It's not because they actually did anything. Of course, we don't want to get cut off because we were guilty of being a jerk to someone and we didn't represent Christ well, but it was just because of what people believed, usually on things like abortion and gender and sexuality. And so I realized that there was really this need for Christians to better understand the source of that hostility, because to a degree, I kind of felt like people were going, what happened? Why do people hate us? You know, what is this about? I try to be nice. I try to be this good person. And yet all these things are happening. So as you know, Seth, that is kind of the wrong expectation. We have to understand that Jesus told us from 2,000 years ago that his followers would be hated. And so I wanted to write this book to help reset those expectations and look at these cases when the culture hates you and say, this is why. This is the underlying nature of the hostility as Scripture tells us. And here's what it looks like to be salt and light anyway. So the subtitle of the book's really important. It's not just when culture hates you, an analysis of the hate and culture, and it is that, but it's also, now that you understand the culture is going to hate you and why Jesus said it would hate you, now that we have that in place, let's talk about what it looks like to actually be a light in the darkness anyway. And so I hope that this book will equip and encourage Christians to really get out there and stand firm on truth, knowing the world will hate you, but you got to do it anyway.
You know what's funny, Natasha, is there's actually a term for this phenomenon. And I'm forgetting what it's called right now. I'm still jet lagged, but it's basically like the common masses with no education. You know, they might say something like, I don't know, like maybe it's just all spiritual and there's just like demonic forces because Christianity is true. But they don't have the PhDs. They don't have the masters. You know, he's probably a plumber who started a business right out of high school. And then as you go up the arc, all of the credentialed people are like denying those self-evident basic eternal truths. And then when you get to the very end of the other arc, like the most highly educated, smartest people, they're like, yeah, it's just all demonic and there's just spiritual principalities and powers because Christianity's true. And when I see things around the world and around the West and our country today, especially with like, what's a great example of your book, the need for your book probably, Islam versus Christianity. Apparently that religion, which by the way, like oftentimes is pro-life, oftentimes is against gay marriage, oftentimes is against LGBTQ insanity. They have a hall pass when it comes to their beliefs in the public square. But once it's Christianity, it's like all the demons come out. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons why Muslims are not hated in the same way as Christians in America. Part of it comes down to the influence of neo-Marxist thinking today and this whole idea of critical theory, where you have the oppressor and the oppressed lens, which you talk about all the time. And I know your listeners are really familiar with, so I'm not going to go and explain all of that. But once you have this oppressor and oppressed lens, Christianity represents the oppressor because we've been the ones who have supposedly held the power in society over the last several hundred years in America. So we're considered to be the ones above the line in the social binary, and every other religion is considered to be under that line, the oppressed. And so that includes Muslims. So even if they have similar values as we do in their religion, they're considered to be an oppressed group. And so they're going to be heralded and held up as a good example of, of we need to support the Muslims because they are an oppressed people. But the other part of this, I think, too, is that they're typically not out in the public square as much. And I don't know if that's just a function of the numbers because they're a much smaller group, or if it's a function of how they think they should be advocating, but they're not out there as much being vocal about the issues that aren't popular. They're not as much talking about pro-life issues or their views on gender and sexuality. So I make the point in the book that you can hold contrarian values as a group. You can be the Heaven's Gate cult, for example. I opened the book with this, talking about the Heaven's Gate cult from several years ago. People can think you're weird. They can think that you're totally wrong. They can have an overall negative impression of you as a group if you hold values that are contrary to the popular moral consensus. But they're not going to hate you unless you're advocating based on those values to change society and the way that society functions. That's where Christians get in trouble, because we not only hold unpopular values, but as part of what we believe, we're called to actually influence society based on those values. Now you're going to be hated. Now you're going to face that hostility. So I think that the reason that Muslims don't get as much of that hostility is really for both of those reasons, because they fall under the oppressor-oppressed lens into the oppressed portion, and they're not out there advocating as publicly for these issues.
Yeah. Well, what's really horrible and shocking, and you've become, I think, a really powerful voice against this, Natasha, is how so many Christian leaders, authors, thinkers, pastors, etc., have now adopted a fundamentally Marxist or Marxian, or whatever you want to call it, framework for how they view justice in society, for how they view loving their neighbor, how they view what the Bible calls, justice and mercy. And perhaps there wasn't a more blatantly in your face example of that than the He Gets Us campaign from not February, not last month, or when's the Super Bowl? Into January or February?
February, yeah.
Yeah, but from the year prior. Now, this recent one had some problems too, but you kind of went viral. I thought your article really took off a year ago responding to this. And I think it's important. It's a vignette, just like Tim Keller is a vignette and a stand-in for the leftward drift of evangelicalism and the shifting of the Overton window. The He Gets Us campaign, the $100 million thing or something like that. It's just a window into how influential Marxism has become on Christians. I mean, this thing was funded by Green family money, right? That's Hobby Lobby, guys. That's green family money. Ed Stetzer, the idiot over at Talbot Theological Seminary, who should be a plumber and under church discipline, is the dean of Talbot and the boss of apparently professors who are no longer willing to say what needs to be said anymore at Biola. And Stetzer was a paid advisor. He admitted this on the Thinking Biblically Biola podcast. He said, I was an advisor on the He Gets Us campaign. I helped with that marketing campaign from a year ago. So I thought, since you brought up this Marxist framework that a lot of Christians have, can you explain to us, because I want to ask you about the one from last month too, but how these ideas are infecting and infiltrating in the church, and particularly that He Gets Us Super Bowl ad from last year, where what I took from it was almost every picture or caricature was an allegedly oppressed versus oppressor picture. Can you kind of remind us what that was? But first, we'd like to thank our sponsor of the Seth Gruber Show, Everylife Diaper Company. It's so easy. I got to tell you, when you've got little babies, right, and we're probably going to have more, right? If you're listening to this, you're going to have babies at some point, or you already did, or your kids are having babies, and so you should get them diapers. It's so annoying to have to run out to the store last minute, okay? Just set up the subscription. Everylife.com, America's pro-life diaper company. In fact, I think you save if you do the subscription. But use promo code SETH10, SETH10 for 10% off your first order, okay? They've got baby wipes, diapers, and then now shampoos and washes for the cute little babies. Non-toxic, right? Organic, all that stuff that we love, right? Everylife.com, promo code SETH10. I know the couple that started. I know the CEO. They're friends of mine and my wife. They're incredible people. And you know that your money's not supporting baby-hating, pro-abortion, anti-family companies. We got to take back the culture, and in part, we got to do that with our spending habits, guys, with our wallet, okay? Make small sacrifices, even if it's a tad more. It doesn't matter. This is what we have to do. We have to fight with our wallets to build the kind of culture that we like. That means shopping in alignment with your values. Go to everylife.com, promo code SETH10 for 10% off your first order, and let them know that we sent you, everylife.com. Thank you, Everylife.
The He Gets Us campaign in general says that they are really doing what they're doing because they have found, according to research, and I don't doubt this research, that people love Jesus, but they don't love his followers. And so they see this as a problem that they're trying to solve. And I would say that that's the wrong problem to try to solve, because if they love Jesus, but they don't love his followers, we have to ask, well, which Jesus do they love?
There you
and
go.
Overwhelmingly, they believe that Jesus was just this, almost like this hippy dippy kind of guy who, welcomes everyone in every way according to whatever you're doing.
Remember,
he gets us, right? He's just like us in every way. And so people love the Jesus that they think exists, but it's not consistent with who Jesus actually was. So is there actually a problem that needs to be solved if people love Jesus but not his followers? I don't think that's necessarily the case, especially because when they say, oh, we don't like his followers, they're usually referring to things that they don't like about his followers that are consistent with what Jesus taught, but they don't like those things. So they say, oh, well, his followers, they hold these views about, abortion and gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
And we don't like that, but we like the Jesus that we think that we know. So fundamentally, I think it's important to understand that trying to solve that problem is going to get you in a lot of trouble, because ultimately you're going to be trying to get people to like Christians better. And when you're trying to get to like Christians better, you're actually going against what Jesus said, because he said to his disciples, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. So if we're trying to get people to like us more, we're going down the wrong path. And so what you see in execution and practice with these ads that you're talking about is that they're very much presented in a way that's palatable to culture. It becomes this social justice Jesus. They're using the exact same terminology that the culture is using. And that's not that's not a cutesy marketing thing. And a lot of people said, well, sometimes you have to talk to people in a way that they're going to understand. My professional background is in marketing. So I totally have sympathy when people talk about, hey, you have to, reach people where they are in a certain sense. But if you're going to reach people with a Jesus that they already believe in and not challenge their understanding, they have no reason to go deeper, to learn more about who Jesus actually is. And so when you're looking at the website and you see something that says Jesus was inclusive, I think this is a perfect example of how misguided this is. Yes, that is how culture talks about how important it is to be inclusive, but to them, inclusivity means that you're inviting everyone to continue to be whoever they want to be, to continue to do whatever they want to do. Right. Jesus was inclusive in a totally different sense. He was inclusive in inviting everyone to come with him, but he was not inclusive in saying everything you want to do, everything you want to say, and whoever you want to be is okay. The problem is when you use the word inclusive, you're misleading people into thinking that he was inclusive in the sense that they think. And so you have all this progressive laden language in the ads, and you see those in last year's ad and this year's ad. You see all these references to how culture sees the social binary in terms of this is an oppressor group. This is a person representing that. And here's a person representing the oppressed. And when you have that, then you're just reinforcing the idea that this is really what society is about. This is the structure of reality. So I could talk about the he gets us stuff for a long time, but I think that kind of summarizes the problem with it, that when you're trying to solve the wrong problem, you're trying to get people to like Jesus in a different way because they're turned off by his followers, you're going down the wrong road. And when you use the language to show them, hey, he's just like you already think he is, that's not helping anyone.
But Natasha, Ed Stetzer, the dean of Talbot, he said it's just pre-evangelism.
Well, pre-evangelism is this idea
I don't
that there
remember
are
that
certain...
from the New Testament, but can you help us?
Well, I think, just to give him the benefit of the doubt and, saying, okay, this is what he considers it to be, pre-evangelism. He's trying to say, okay, well, maybe there are these ways that before you're getting to the gospel, before you're telling people about who Jesus is in the fullness, maybe we need to kind of warm them up to the idea of Jesus. Maybe we need to get them interested first. So I think that is a fair idea, but let me tell you why I think that the execution of he gets us is not effective pre-evangelism. So like I said, my background is in marketing, and oftentimes there's this framework used in marketing called the AIDA model, meaning if you want to get someone to make a decision to purchase something, so in the context of buying a car, for example, they're going to go through these stages: awareness, interest, desire, and action. Yeah. So awareness, interest, desire, and action. I think, again, to be charitable, that what Stetzer is saying is that pre-evangelism is kind of like the awareness level and the interest level in the campaign. It's saying, hey, let's get people aware of Jesus and that he was somebody that they should become interested in. Then let's get them interested in him by using some of this language that they're already interested in. Let's use some of these ideas. They're interested in justice and fairness. Let's pull them in with that. And then maybe once they dig deeper, they'll get to the desire and the action stage to reach out and learn more. That's what I'm sure he means. But I still feel that this is really misguided because, as any marketer knows, when you start with awareness and interest, you have to generate awareness in the right end product. Right. You have to generate interest in the right end product. And I hate to use Jesus as a product, but we're talking about marketing here, right? So if you want to get people to actually do something, to follow up, to make a decision, to learn more about Jesus, to follow up with the church, whatever your action point is going to be, you have to generate the right kind of awareness, the right kind of interest. Otherwise, it's like generating awareness, interest in a motorcycle, and you're hoping to get somebody interested in buying a Tesla at some point, right? You're in two different marketing funnels completely. So none of this, though, surprises me that this is how they would approach it because, and I've documented this in my lengthy articles on my websites about He Gets Us, that there are all kinds of examples from their sites where they make clear there are all kinds of people with different beliefs on their team. And they have progressive Christians and they have conservative Christians. It really strikes me that the progressive Christians are doing all the front end work. They're putting the ads together and they're doing the articles on the website, which are very problematic. And then if you really dig into the site, then you can find some statements statements about how, we believe that Jesus is the Son of God. It's almost like that's just there to keep the conservative Christians happy so they can point to it when people question the progressive stuff and say, no, look, this is what we actually mean. Now, I don't know if that's fair or not. I'm saying that's how it seems to me. I would not be surprised if that's the case.
Wow. You sharing that reminded me of the story of Don Richardson in Papua New Guinea. Do you remember this amazing story?
I read it a long time ago. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, the concept of the peace child.
Yes.
That's gospel contextualization. That's awareness, like what you're talking about, but with the right message, right? Basically, for people listening, the Richardsons went to, I don't know if it was called Papua or Papua New Guinea at the time. And this is, I think, the 70s. And warring tribes, okay? Like tribal warfare, like completely savages. I mean, eating other tribes, killing their babies. But there was this understanding that the only way for them to obtain peace was through each tribe sacrificing one of their child to the other. And that child represented peace between the tribe. And then anyways, the Richardsons are like, could you be trying to tell the gospel any harder? And so they begin preaching that Christ is that peace child, right? Anyways, but that's a good example in contextualization of the gospel in culture. Whereas I think a lot of what we're seeing today is more trying to get attaboys and accolades from the culture with a new gospel made in your own image, so that people will like you, which seems to sort of be the subject of your book. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I think, I hate to say this, but I do think that a lot of Christians are naive in these areas, because when I have posted about He Gets Us, plenty of people see what I'm talking about and say, yes, okay, thanks for saying this. But there are plenty of other people who will comment like, I'm just glad that there are commercials talking about Jesus.
I saw those responses.
And that's hard. That's really hard for me to deal with, honestly, because it feels so naive. I mean, are we just happy that Jesus is going to be mentioned in any sense whatsoever in a commercial? Because I think that we have to be only happy if the right Jesus is being talked about. So I think there is this naivety, and I do think it comes back to the subjects that I'm talking about in this book, that Christians want to be liked, and so they like the happy Jesus that they see in these commercials because they have the wrong expectations. They think that we need people to like us more, and that's exactly the opposite of the message that Jesus had for us.
Guys, it's here. It's so epic. You do not want to miss The Last Stand, baby. The Last Stand. I told you about this, okay? We're in a season of The Last Stand. June 21st, Downey, California, at Calvary Chapel, Downey, okay? One of my warrior brother church friends. We're taking back June. Jack Hibbs, David Harris Jr., Steve Dace, John Amanchukwu, and many more. You're not going to want to miss the other announcements of speakers coming soon. We're bringing revival to California because California is the testing ground for most of the nation's evils. And if we can send good news out of California, maybe it's not too late. Come experience bold worship, powerful speakers, and fellowship, right? That's so important. Fellowship with thousands of culture warriors who have a heart for the unborn, the babies, the family in America that's in shambles because of so many of these progressive modern evils that we've tolerated. Go to thelaststand.com and get your ticket today. Thelaststand.com and use code SETH10, SETH10 for 10% off your ticket. You got that? Thelaststand.com. Tickets are going fast. Use promo code SETH10 for 10% off your ticket, and I'll see you on June 21st in Southern California. I saw this tweet from Preston Sprinkle the other day. We've talked about him on this show before, especially with our good friend Patty Height, who's a former lesbian evangelist now, celibate, incredible ministry and voice, similar to Rosaria Butterfield's ministry. And some of these individuals have really, really warned the church and myself about this dude, Preston Sprinkle's, Side B Christianity. And we've gone into depth about that on the show here. But he tweeted this thing out, and it kind of reminded me of your book, and you responded to it. But he said, "My political theology has allowed me to be so hopeful in this political season. I reject the empire, yet submit to it because Jesus is king. I embrace and celebrate Christ's multi-ethnic kingdom and the many ways we are spreading good in the world. Christians should not be captivated by their binary political playing field that's been handed to us by Babylon. Hashtag no king but Christ." It sounds like a lot of gobbledygook to me. And I'm not even sure what all of that means. I mean, the implications of what he's saying here, I have a lot of questions about the implications of them. It's very strange. But this doesn't surprise me coming from him. But this is like becoming very, very popular. There was someone came up to me at CareNet. I don't know why CareNet invited me to speak at their thing, and someone came up and said that one of the breakout session speakers said that John the Baptist is a perfect example of how you can lose your ministry by getting too political. And and this breakout session speaker said, Natasha, that if John the Baptist had kept his mouth shut and not started getting political, because he called out the king for his illegal marriage, then he wouldn't have lost his head and he could have had decades more of fruitfulness. And that was like a Christian, I don't know, fundraising guru at a Christian conference. And wow. that seems to be like Preston Sprinkle to a T. Anyways, you responded to this. I almost want to read your whole response, but I'd rather have you give us your take to this. But I'm seeing this divide more and more, which is sort of this third-wayism. It's sort of this like Romans 13, be obedient to the governing authorities. Jesus is coming back. He's the king. Jesus is neither left nor right. He's not a Republican nor a Democrat. Getting behind any political party in any way is like trading your birthright for a bowl of porridge. We're called to another way. And all this kind of, isms and speech, which sounds like, if you're not a deep thinker, it sounds persuasive, right? Because like Christ does call us out of the world, right? He does say we're set apart. So can you kind of just respond, not just to Sprinkle, but like to that position and that opinion? Because that might be the thing I struggle the most over, getting Christians past so they can engage on fundamentally spiritual and theological issues, both in the cultural and political realm. But that seems to be a roadblock where they're like, oh, I can't get political. What are your thoughts on all that? Just riff.
Well, I put my thoughts on all that into this book. Honestly, this book is sort of an answer and a response to this kind of thinking. It really is. There's so much bad thinking when it comes to politics and the church, I think. And it's because we haven't had discipleship. We have not had discipleship in the church on how to think well about what it means to exhibit public influence. And so, C.S. Lewis has a book, famously Mere Christianity. I think of my book as a mere public influence for Christians to get you thinking about what should it look like. Because we have taken on so many of these mantras in the church, like Christians shouldn't seek power, for example, is one that I talk about the book. Or we shouldn't impose our values on others, or we shouldn't be partisan, which is kind of the heart of what I think Sprinkle is talking about in that tweet. But at the end of the day, when people are making this claim specifically about, we shouldn't align one way or another, just think about that statistically. I mean, this is just a logical problem, right? Statistically speaking, unless you come out exactly 50-50 as a group, you're going to lean one way or another. And I have these statistics in the book that show that it's only evangelical Christians and Mormons who actually lean conservatively. Every other group leans even more strongly to the left. So you have historically Black Protestants, you have Jewish people, you have every other group who are going further to the left than we are to the right. And yet no one's talking about that. No one's warning them, hey, you are too partisan. You are lining up too much in the other way. So much of this, Seth, is really just, thinking through this logically. Like you said, it sounds good, but it doesn't actually work out in practice. In any given society at any given time, it's entirely possible that if Christians are going to be advocating for the common good according to their biblical values, they're going to line up more with one political group than with another. Why is that inherently problematic? It's entirely possible that that's the case if there are certain groups that are saying, hey, our group is all about worshiping Zeus. We want to force everyone to worship Zeus. And another group over here is saying, well, we want you to have freedom to worship whoever you want. If 100% of Christians in that society lined up behind the group that said we want freedom of worship, would we say that's a problem, that they're being too partisan? Of course not. It doesn't make any sense, right? We would say, well, no, that it's totally a logical outworking of the worldview that this group, this Christian group, holds. So partisanship is not a problem inherently. And so when people like Preston Sprinkle are making this claim that, well, we just kind of need to rise above the political fray, we shouldn't be so closely identified with one side or the other, that sounds good, but if you look at any given society, it might be the case that we need to line up more with one side. And in saying that, that's not that I'm saying, oh, this is, for example, the Republican Party, this is the biblical party. I haven't said that. I've never said that. I wouldn't say that. Right. But I would say that just because there is no party that perfectly lines up with biblical values, that doesn't mean that therefore every other party is equally problematic. And I think this is the flaw in logic, because a lot of people will make these kinds of claims who are kind of like-minded with Preston Sprinkle and how he's saying this, that, none of them are the Jesus party, therefore they're all equally problematic and we need to not associate. We have to understand, logically speaking, scripturally speaking, there are going to be some groups that are worse than others. When we have a Democratic Party that is promoting the celebration of killing unborn babies and everything that entails, when they're celebrating destructive gender ideology, when they're minimizing the importance of parental rights versus the state, we have all these different examples of things that are very strongly contrary to important views of reality based on biblical teaching. It shouldn't surprise anyone if we're going to lean more to the right. That's not a problem. So, like I said, I could say so much more, and I did in this book, because I really want to help Christians to think so much better about these things, to stop hearing phrases that they think sound good, and they're actually not. Don't seek power. Well, do you want the power to do good? Of course you do. Seek the power to do good.
Yep. When culture hates you, that's why everyone should get Natasha's book. Is this Babylon? Is America Babylon? I hear this a lot, Natasha. I got this from a pastor friend ages ago. He actually ended up changing his mind, which was cool. But he said something like, I think that America is Babylon, and that we can't expect to reform Babylon. So we just got to save as many souls from the fire as we can in the time we have. Is that an apt analogy? And if not, why not?
Well, let me give you a quick test that you can use to test any of these kinds of statements. I talk about this in the book. I call it the slavery test. Whenever someone has an objection to political involvement, try this. Start by saying, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because, and then fill in the objection. So let's try it. Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because we're like Babylon. You can't reform Babylon. Would we say that? No one would say that today, right? No one would say, oh, yeah, because we're like Babylon, we shouldn't have worked to end slavery. Because looking back, everyone today would acknowledge that slavery was an objectively evil institution as practiced in the United States. It shouldn't have happened. We shouldn't be treating image bearers like property. It had to go, regardless of how many people at the time were open to the gospel. Right. That's the important part. Would we look back and say, well, we should have just been preaching the gospel so that we could wait for everyone's moral sensibilities to be transformed as they became saved, and then eventually all of society would change? I mean, did we really want to wait for this critical mass of souls to be transformed? I think we look back and we say, but wait a second, this was an urgent need. These were people's lives that had to be set free from slavery, whether or not people were saved at the time. We said, no, we need the power to do what is right, and we also need to preach the gospel. So many people see this as a false dichotomy, like, well, we're preaching the gospel or we're advocating for righteousness in society. That's just a false dichotomy. We can do both. We should be doing both.
Right.
And so when people say, well, just preach the gospel, I think they have a very limited view of what the gospel is. If we're saying the gospel is the good news of Jesus Christ because we're sinners and now we can be saved by putting our trust in Jesus as our Lord and Savior, that's amazingly good news. But there's so much that flows from that. If you now love Jesus, Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. What are his commandments? Number 1, to love God, and number 2, to love others. Well, when we advocate for righteousness in society, that is one part of loving others. We're caring about the quality of their lives in the context of the societies in which they live. Right. That's part of what it means to love people. Right. So aside from the fact that, no, we're not Babylon, we're not even in a remotely similar situation today as the Babylonians and the Jewish exiles who were there temporarily and then were going back to their homeland. That's not comparable in any meaningful way. But aside from that, it's not that we can't reform society at all just because we live in a non-believing world that's under the governing rule of Satan. We know spiritually this is under the governing rule of Satan, but we're still called to advocate for the moral health of societies. Look at the Old Testament. Look how much God was mad at the nations, to put it lightly, because of the injustices that they practice, not just for Israel, but for the surrounding nations. Yeah. God cares about the moral health and functioning of societies. Yes, he cares about individual salvation, but he also cares about the health of societies.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, Natasha, you make a lot of sense. Can we make you the dean at Talbot? This tweet from Preston Sprinkle, to me, is like completely disqualifying of his entire ministry. Like, he should just step down right now. This level of biblical ignorance on full display. It's like, dude, why are you a Christian voice in any sphere, in any area of influence? It's pathetic. Benjamin Shetler, a good friend of mine, you may have checked out his ministry before. He responded to Preston and said, "America is Babylon is as foolish as America is Israel."
Yeah, I don't think that the analogy holds up. Now, to be fair, I want to say that Preston has a whole book on this concept called Exiles, I think. I have not read the book, so I'm sure he works his ideas out more fully there. I don't want to misrepresent his views, but I'm responding to that specific tweet and many other tweets that he's had that are along the same lines.
I got in trouble with a lot of these sort of immediatists. They call themselves abolitionists, Natasha, but I call them immediatists because I want to abolish abortion too. But what they mean is, like, any incremental bill is sinful, even if you tried to abolish it, but you didn't have the votes. So you put a rape and incest exception and you didn't want to, but it got you the votes from the rhinos and some babies were saved. They would say that that's apostasy that requires church discipline and repentance, and I think that's ridiculous. And so I got into it with them before the election on X because a lot of them, they're political purists, right? They're sort of pietists. I call it navel gazing as the world burns. But they were saying we can't vote for Trump. In fact, it's a sin to do. You should not as a Christian because of his pro-choice rhetoric and his support of abortion. And, of course, I was like ripping him Trump a new one during that time. And pro-life outrage worked in one example, by the way, Natasha. He was like, he seemed like he was going to vote for the radical pro-abortion amendment in Florida. And then Pro-Life America was outraged. And then 24 hours later, he said, I'm voting against the radical abortion amendment in Florida.
I remember that.
It's an example of, like, my position being the better one. But a lot of these people were like, you can't vote for Trump. I won't. They were actually going on X, on some of their big follower platforms, showing a picture of them, like, writing in someone's name, their friend for president, who's not going to become president. It's like, oh, I feel so good about myself. My hands aren't dirty. My hands aren't bloody because I didn't get engaged in this Harris versus Trump thing, and I opted for this other sort of thing. And I started saying something, and it's the same thing I'd sort of say to Sprinkle and these other people, but I want to get your thoughts on it. Is basically, well, thank God not enough people listened to your recommendations on the election. Thank God, because if more people had, we wouldn't have won those 3 or 4 key swing states, and we'd be cutting off the genitals of minors still right now in America. Okay, we'd be throwing pro-life sidewalk counselors in prison right now. Many of them would still be rotting in prison, away from their 3-year-old daughter, their 4-year-old daughter, their spouse, their kids, their grandkids. Like kids would still be being kidnapped by the state of California. It happened in Montana too. Gender confused minor from their parents by CPS. Thank God, not enough Christians opted for third way, Preston. So but then if you get too engaged in this fight, you're labeled a Christian nationalist. And so I just saw this quote from Dan Allender, who I heard speak at Westmont years ago when I was a student there. He's best friends with Tremper Longman, the former Old Testament professor there, who's a total evangelicals for Biden Harris idiot. And Dan Allender, he's an Old Testament, he's a Christian speaker guy. He said, Christian nationalism, he's tweeting NT Wright, sorry. Christian nationalism is impoverished as it seeks a kingdom without a cross. It pursues a victory without mercy. It acclaims God's love of power rather than the power of God's love. And then this is the phrase that we're given, Natasha, by pietist, third-wayism, preach the gospel Christian apologists and individuals when we try to use political tools at our disposal to ban abortion, or we get behind Trump while holding him accountable, while going after him, but we get behind him because we really want to stop sexually mutilating 14-year-olds. You've gotten that too. Help us think through that.
Yeah, I think that the difficult part of it is that a lot of times when people are making these claims, they sound super spiritual, right? Because they're talking about how we're not following the cross because we're blinded by the kingdom on earth, and they're kind of driving this wedge between the two things. But you can follow the cross, you can follow Jesus while also pursuing good in an earthly sense. And so they're kind of just conflating these things. And then Christians go, well, I want to be spiritual. I want to do the right thing, right? And so they get confused by this kind of language. And it is really problematic because at the end of the day, you're right. If Kamala had been elected, we would have seen a lot of different things happening right now than what we're seeing. But again, because Christians have not been discipled about what it should look like to advocate for righteousness and what the Bible says on these things, a lot of Christians got confused, and a lot of Christians thought that they were looking for the person with the best character, for example. I know that you heard this over and over, right, Seth? It's but Trump's character, he's such an awful person. But the Bible doesn't tell us that the purpose of government is to find the best person. That sounds kind of crazy. We think, wait, what do you mean? Wait a second for this, right? But when we look at Romans 13 and what Romans 13 says about the purpose of government, that God has given us this institution of government and that all authority is from him, doesn't mean that it's always going to be executed well. We have plenty of examples of poor governmental execution, but the function itself is God-given. And why is it given to us? Well, that passage tells us to promote what's good and restrain what's evil.
Or to be a terror.
Or to be a terror. So if we think about that in terms of the purpose of government, well, it's very subjective to look at character in a sense, because you could look and say, well, the character quality I'm going to look at is courage. Okay, well, in that sense, I bet a lot of people would look at Trump's character and say that, well, he is courageous, right? So what character quality are you going to look at? When people are talking about Trump's character, they're talking about his immorality when it comes a lot of times to his sex life and the things that he has said about women in the past. Those aren't good things. They're terrible things. I'm not here to defend Trump and the things that he has done. However, if the policies that he is going to implement in this society are going to be the ones that better promote the good and restrain the evil, then that's going to be consistent with what Christians should be supporting, because that's what's going to be implemented in society, not his past deeds. And I know that's hard to grapple with, because in an ideal world, of course, we would love to have someone who was a follower of Jesus, who had a very clean looking life, not that, anyone is fundamentally good, but of course we would want somebody whose personal life looked better than Trump's personal life. Sure. That would be great. But we had two candidates to choose from. We have to look at the policies. At the end of the day, we're not putting into office the person who had the best personal life in some way. We're looking for the person who's going to have the right policies for this society. And it was just as much about stopping Kamala.
Yep.
I didn't know what to expect exactly from Trump. I mean, we know what he said. We knew what he, had said he was committed to. I've been thrilled with most of the stuff that he has been doing since he got in office. So
Yep.
I'm glad to see that.
Yep. I mean, no, to your point about courage and the right leader, which might not always be the most moral. And I know that sounds weird for people, but like, here's an example. Mike Pence. Mike Pence would have made a horrible president. That man caves under the most little pressure from what we can call it the deep state or the blob or whatever you want to call it. When we've needed Mike Pence, he's gone. And yet he seems to have a great marriage. He seems to be a great dad. He's very outspokenly pro-life. And yet, guess who he did not support? Trump. He didn't support Trump. Which is like, for me, voting for Trump was actually quite a bit more about stopping Kamala, actually. And then as a byproduct, I'm like stoked on all the stuff that is happening for the most part. I just did a whole episode ripping Trump for the executive order on IVF. So like, we'll call balls and strikes. But you just made me think of that. Like, I would way rather have Trump as a president with maybe a dirty mouth sometimes, and some questionable policies than pure, gentle, and lowly, loving husband and father Mike Pence, who I don't think would have been able to handle that position and the kind of leadership and courage it requires. So it's a great point. Do you remember it was last year, Matt Chandler was on Lecrae's podcast, and he was like, the left, I could almost like see him just like smoking a doobie first. He was like, the left wants the kingdom, man, and not the king. And the right wants the king and not the kingdom. And Lecrae's like, And I was watching this, Natasha, going like, what the heck does that mean? That's a bunch of gobbledygook. So the left wants the kingdom, really? I didn't know that the kingdom was sexually mutilating the next generation, ripping their arms off, flushing them down the toilets of America at the tune of 650,000 little lives a year, throwing grannies who pray outside of abortion centers into federal prison, and renting poor women's uteruses so that rich white men like Pete Buttigieg can purchase their baby and deny it a mother. Wow, the left wants the kingdom and not the king, huh? That's a strange kingdom. But like that's that sort of like Preston Sprinkles like third way. Like we're called to something else, and the left wants a piece of that, and the right wants a piece of that, but neither one has the total gospel. And so Christ is calling us out of both political parties to stand in the middle. And it's sort of like that same thing. And it's so strange to me how like persuasive, apparently, and attractive that is to so many Christians, many of whom I know. What's the solution as we tell people to go buy your book? How would you help direct the church and lay believers into something that maybe is a little bit more historic in terms of Christian orthodoxy?
Well, we have to talk about these things in the church. That's the first problem. We're not talking about them because a lot of pastors don't want to get quote unquote political. One of the points that I make in the book is that when we're talking about whether or not we should be involved in politics, we have to define politics because everyone's bringing different baggage to the conversation when we use that word. But all that politics means is the way that people living in communities make decisions about how they're going to live together. That's it. That's the process of politics. So when we talk about politics in the United States, we're talking about, okay, as a country, how are we going to live together? So of course, as Christians who are citizens of this country, we need to think through, okay, well, if we're part of this process in a constitutional republic and we're going to advocate for something as part of that process, what should it be? Don't we think that if Christianity is true, that it's the actual picture of reality, that we're going to have something to say that's going to be relevant to how society should function? Don't you think that our churches should be preparing us to advocate rightly and scripturally according to what the Bible teaches? It seems like a no-brainer to me, but we're not talking about it in the church because churches are afraid that they're going to lose people. We're going to be too divisive. We have to stop being afraid of being divisive. The Bible doesn't tell us not to divide. It tells us to divide rightly. And we have to get this right. And, it's interesting because I do this Unshaken conference with Frank Turek and Elisa Childers, and we've done 8 dates already. We're doing 4 more dates this year, and it's all about equipping and encouraging Christians to stand firm on these truths in the culture.
Yeah.
Well, as we were out seeking churches, we had to find churches of a certain size in order to be able to hold the events. And it's been eye-opening to me and disappointing over the last couple of years that we've been doing this to know that a lot of large churches, they won't even touch a conference like this. When they look at the schedule of the day and they see that we're talking about things like social justice and sexuality and gender ideology, all these kinds of topics that we're hitting on, they'll say, well, we prefer to talk about those issues in-house, but yet I don't see them talking about them, or they just don't want to talk about them at all. That's divisive, or we've been told that our church has a lot of different views on those things. If your church has a lot of different views on those subjects, then you're not discipling your church. You shouldn't have a lot of different views on those subjects. You shouldn't be afraid to talk about it and come to the one true view based on biblical reality. So we have a real problem that churches are not willing to talk about this. So whenever there's something that the church overwhelmingly is not addressing, and I used to talk a lot about parenting specifically in this way because a lot of churches weren't equipping parents with an understanding of apologetics. It's the same issue. Right. There are 2 solutions. It's either going to come in from the top down, meaning pastors are going to start bringing this into the church more, or it's going to come from the bottom up. It's going to come from people, individuals in churches who say, this is important and I need to do something about it. So for pastors, if there are pastors listening to this, I really hope that you'll consider these things. I really hope that you'll consider that, hey,
Amen.
The Bible represents reality. It's not just, a belief system, obviously. And so if it represents reality, then it speaks to everything in our lives, including how we participate in society. Don't be afraid to speak to that. We have to speak to that. And for the person who's listening, who's not a pastor, and they're concerned about these things and their pastor doesn't talk about them, I'd encourage you to maybe talk to your pastor about it. Ask for a meeting. Do it with grace. Don't go in there and be like, why aren't you talking about these issues today, right? Yeah. They have a lot on their plate. There's a lot going on. It's a very difficult job to be a pastor, but there's no reason that you can't go to your pastor and say, hey, these issues are really important, and I don't think we've talked about them very much in the church. Is there a reason? Is it something that you find important also? And if you do, is it something that you might be considering talking about in the future? See what he says. If he says, I don't think that we should be talking about these things because they're too political, too divisive, then be prepared to have that conversation. Read the book. Read When Culture Hates You. It's going to give you all those talking points to explain why that's not the case. Give your pastor a copy of the book. I know a lot of people actually have told me they've given their pastors a copy of this. And so have that conversation with your pastor, but do it with grace. Obviously, you want to handle these things correctly. And even if your pastor doesn't want to talk about it from the pulpit, which I would say is a problem, but even if that's the case, consider how you can help educate other people in your church. Do a book study, whether it's on a book like mine or if it's on a specific individual issue like the Case for Life, for example. Take a book and read it together and get people more equipped to speak into these individual issues as well. Because a lot of times, even if somebody might be kind of reserved about saying, well, I don't want to read a book about, politics or getting involved, but I do care about unborn babies, maybe they're willing to read a book just about the abortion issue. Praise the Lord. Start there. Get them thinking about it. So sometimes you can get more people interested by addressing those individual issues. Yep. Long answer to your question, but I think that we got to get the church involved in this, and that's either going to come from the top down or the bottom up. And whoever you are listening to this, consider what you can do to get more people talking about it, because bad political theology hurts people. It means we're not advocating for the things we should be advocating for in society, and people get hurt. Lives are destroyed, and babies are killed.
Yep. Really well said, Natasha. And I only thing I'd add to that is that there may be a greater problem of believers who do have all the right positions on these topics that we've discussed and haven't discussed, but refuse to stand, to live out, to defend the truths that they say they believe when it really matters. And that's why C.S. Lewis said, courage is not simply one of the virtues, but every virtue at its testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. So, guys, go get Natasha's book, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. Get it wherever you get your books. It's newly out, and I'm sure it's selling like hotcakes, but you want to help Natasha out because her mission is valuable, and it's going to awaken believers to what's going on. Remember, Trump is only a tourniquet. This is not a season to put the brakes on or to take your foot off the gas. There are human beings, babies to be saved, families to be preserved, children to save, laws to pass, to promote the good, the true, and the beautiful, and to be a terror to evil. So thank you, Natasha. Thank you. We hope your book sells like hotcakes. We got to get you at some event sometime. We got to do more together. We're such a fan of your voice, your ministry, your platform, and go give them heaven.
Thanks so much, Seth. Great talking with you.
You too.